Okay, we compiled a Hello World program, and as you can see, there's a general constructs.cpp file in this same directory. As I said, I've already written this code from a previous video that I tried to do with the script, so let's just open it and look at it. To start with, let's, I guess, comment out the struct stuff. We'll get into that later in the video. Oh, by the way, it's a good example. This is how you comment something out in C++. It's these two dashes. Another way you can do it is if you want a multi-line comment, you can do something like this. Sorry. And anything in between here is a comment. I typically just use the two dashes because I'm using Vim and it's easy to multi-line comment like that, or easier actually. So let's just look at this code right here. These lines 11 through 18. This is how you define a function in C++. As we saw in the previous video, we have this main function right here. We can define any sort of function we want at any point in the code, so long as the function isn't defined directly inside of another function, which is kind of a drawback of C++ in my opinion, but it's a discussion for another day, an argument for another day, I guess. So in this function that I had created in this previous video, I called it parameterized for loop. It was just the name of the function, and here it returns a Boolean, which is like in any other language you have a type that defines true or false, right? C++ is no different. So it returns a Boolean. You can see that in these two return statements. We're returning true, and here we're returning false. It also takes in a parameter. I just added this just to illustrate, like, hey, this is how you would pass in a parameter in a C++ function. Below that is a for loop where we're using the parameter. So essentially what this for loop will do is you'll pass in a function, as you can see, or an integer, as you can see down here on line 32. You'll pass in an integer, in this case 11. The for loop will run from 0 to 11. And if the for loop length is ever greater than 10, it will return true. This essentially is a kind of a useless function, but it illustrates a couple of different syntax aspects of C++. In this case, right, the for loop would run once. It would be I would be equal to 0. It'll check. It'll go that 11 is greater than 10, and it'll return true immediately. It won't run through the rest of the for loop. So if we were to run this, we would expect to see. Actually, let's run it just so we can see what we would actually see here. Let me get into this directory. And then the same way we ran it before, let's run it. See, as I said, it gets compiled. When the code gets compiled, you'll see immediately that you have syntax errors, and it won't let you compile the code, which is actually safer. Something you want, especially when you're dealing with money, right, or cryptocurrency. In this case, it's complaining that this struct variable was not defined, and then I was trying to use it down here on line 21. So it was saying, I don't know what that variable is. So now we compile it. It compiles successfully, and when we print this out, we see a 1. Why do we see a 1? Because here, as I said, it will hit this if statement and will return true. Well, true it's not really a base type in C++ per se, I guess. Behind the scenes, it gets treated, I think, as a bit. So it would be a 1 in this case, or a 0 in the case of false. You can actually do some interesting bitwise manipulations in C++ because of things like this that other languages don't have. So that's always nice. So we've got that. We know how to define functions. We know how to pass in parameters. We know how to return values from those parameters. As I said before, structs come up very often in EOS smart contract development. So here I added this little short toy example to show you how you would define a struct. A struct really, it's kind of similar to a class in any other language, in object-oriented programming languages. You can actually define classes in C++ in much the same way as you could define a struct, but it's really just like a logical collection of data of some kind. So in this case, I've decided that I'm going to have a for loop control struct, and in there it's going to have a number of iterations, and it's going to have a Boolean which is greater than 10. Here I'm creating this struct, right? I have this for loop control f control object, if you want to call it that, object struct, kind of the same thing in this case. Here I'm setting the number of iterations variable, which we defined up here as part of this logical collection of data. And then I'm setting is greater than 10 equal to true. In this case, obviously it is greater than, the 100 is greater than 10, so here we have f control is greater than 10. Essentially, I think what I was trying to do here is like remove this if statement and put it all into one struct, where all the logic associated with this if statement and this for loop is contained there instead. Again, it's a stupid trivial example, but it was just something I threw together so we could talk about structs, we can talk about functions, things like that. So if we did the same thing here and printed this out using the struct rather than passing in the parameter, what would we see? And we can see that we see the same thing, because here we're returning is greater than 10. One thing to note though is this for loop would actually run all the way through to the number of iterations and then return, whereas here we're short-circuiting in the top part, we're short-circuiting immediately and returning the true. So like it wouldn't return, if we passed in 100 into this function, it would return much quicker than the one using the struct, sorry, this one using the struct. Okay, I think that's probably enough for this video. I think in the next one we might look at STL, data structures and algorithms that are built right into the language. Another thing I was just thinking about this. I didn't have it in the course outline, but another thing I've heard people having trouble with are the boost libraries, so we might look into those as well. But definitely in the next video we'll check out STL. Okay, see you then.